Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
When GI Bill abuse surfaced a few years ago, veterans' benefits kept flowing to schools that met higher education standards but failed veterans themselves. Now, as accreditation standards are back under review, advocates say lessons from that era still haven't been fully applied. They're pushing to give Title 38, the Veterans Benefits Law, a clearer role in determining which schools qualify for GI Bill dollars. Joining me to explain how those changes could better protect veterans before harm occurs is Vice President for Veterans and Military Policy at Veterans Education Success, Will Hubbard. Will, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I feel like this has got to be a deja vu moment for you at Veteran Education Success. Many veterans groups remember the headlines from almost a decade ago when GI Bill money was flowing to for-profit universities that later turned out to be low quality or deceptive. Is what you're seeing now in the marketplace reminiscent of those times 10 years ago?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, the answer is yes. There tends to be a bit of a cycle when it comes to these predatory operations, and there will be turnover with their leadership, and they'll disappear for a bit. Sometimes there will be some regulations or some changes in the statute, and then they find new loopholes and new ways to get around it. And so we land right back here with, unfortunately, in the wake, students, their families sharing the negative stories and negative experiences that they've had, and we need to do it all over again.
Organizations like yours have spent years calling attention to these risks. The last round did result in statutory reform that ultimately was only implemented about 3 years ago. Really long tail for that process. Why is accreditation rather than enforcement after the fact now such a central focus of groups like yours?
People don't realize the role that accreditation plays for Title 38 or U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs education benefits, even though it's not directly responsive to Title 38, since it is within the Department of Education. It's a major gatekeeping element to ensure that the schools that get into the system to begin with are going to be offering some level of quality. And so even though it's not necessarily directly related to veterans, folks using their GI Bill benefits are definitely looking for some degree of quality. And sadly to say, it really has not been as successful as we would have liked to have seen, which is why we're calling for changes to accreditation and welcome the opportunity. Fortunately, we just see the direction of that conversation going the wrong way, not the right way.
Why do you think it takes so long for these kinds of concerns to surface into formal hearings or sanctions against these universities?
The reality is most students don't realize the lack of quality or lack of value, more importantly, of the credential or degree that they get from a university so a student, oftentimes a first generation student in the case of veterans and their families, may go through an entire progression of a program and then go look for jobs. And it's at that moment when they're not getting any calls back, they're not getting any responses or calls for interviews, that they realize that the value of their degree, unfortunately, is not all it was cracked up to be. And oftentimes they do their own research at that point and come to realize that they were either scammed or tricked into a degree that just frankly wasn't worth the paper that it's printed on.
I want to pull on something that you said right at the beginning of that response. You talked about first-generation students. The GI Bill really was, even in its initial founding, created to help people get that first generation into university. And it's still such an enabler. But what difficulty does that pose for the families who are trying to navigate this process?
For many individuals that are using education benefits of any type for the first time, perhaps the first to go to school in their family, they don't have the intrinsic cultural knowledge that many others take for granted. For example, they may not be familiar with what accreditation is or the different types of accreditation and why it matters. They may not be familiar with the different types of programs or resources at their disposal and how they can use them, and sometimes in combination. So there's really just a lack of knowledge. And it's unfortunately, it's that asymmetric information environment that schools prey on. They take advantage of the fact that these students are not familiar with the rules and essentially in the system because they've been told their whole life that education is important and good, which we agree with, but they don't know much beyond that. And those schools are the ones that are looking to find students who don't have that information at their fingertips to take advantage of.
I'm speaking with Will Hubbard. He's Vice President for Veterans and Military Policy at Veterans Education Success. Well, with that background, talk to me about what concerns you now about how the Department of Education is conducting its accreditation reviews today.
Unfortunately, it seems the department is more focused on culture war type topics versus pulling up their sleeves and getting the real work of accreditation reform done. The reality is culture wars, it affects such a small percentage of the population, and not an unimportant percentage, but that's not how you're going to fix the system by addressing issues related to these topics. So we just really would like to see accreditation actually focus on real standards and real outcomes more so than having these strange culture war competitions. And the department's approach largely to this issue has been to focus on adding more accreditors. And the reality is that it doesn't matter if there's 5 accreditors or 5,000 accreditors. It's the standards that ultimately are what's important.
Is the Department of Education taking in voices like Veterans Education Success as they're considering accreditation?
We brought 2 student veterans to town recently and have more coming. One was a veteran themselves and one was a military spouse. And they tried to speak at the Department of Education proceedings in the first round of negotiations on the rulemaking, and they were denied the opportunity to speak, which is atypical. Normally, what the department allows at the end of each day is a public comment period so that anybody following the proceedings and any member of the public can share their particular perspective or voice on the issue. And that was something they were denied. So we were incredibly, disappointed to see that, but frankly, it wasn't quite a surprise that this department is continuing to not allow for a wide variety of voices in the conversation.
While these hearings are unfolding, veterans and military spouses and children are still choosing schools and spending benefits that they can't get back. So what does all of this uncertainty mean for folks who are trying to rebuild their careers and families right now using GI Bill benefits?
You highlight a critical point, which is if an individual uses their GI Bill and find themselves in a situation where they realize it was a scam operation or it was a very low quality experience and the marketplace is not reacting to their degree or credential, there's nothing for them to do except try to move on with their life. There's no way for them to get their benefits back. Unlike traditional students that may be using a Department of Education money or grants or loans, there are processes for them to get them restored. If, for example, courts find that it was fraudulent, so they can get their benefits back. But veterans and their family members are actually the only ones that are left out of that equation, because right now there's no statutory authority for the Department of Veterans Affairs to actually give those GI Bill benefits back. And that's something we're working very hard to change.
Will, walk us through a couple of examples of what this feels like from someone who's in the middle of it. You say you brought those 2 folks in to speak in the hearings. What was their experience like?
It's incredible to see these individuals who've had such difficult experiences with higher education, to see them advocate to legislators and their staff on Capitol Hill and in various departments and agencies. And there's such pain, but also passion to make it different because they know that they're speaking on not only their behalf, but also their family, their friends, colleagues they've worked with, and frankly, everybody else that's coming behind them. So it's powerful to watch, but it's difficult to see it and understand that the system right now is not recognizing these concerns as valid. And that's something that we're working very hard to affect in a positive way. And we're always grateful for students who are willing to speak up because that's how you get it done.
From the advocacy community's perspective, like yours, what kind of changes would you hope might be put in place to prevent the challenges we've just been discussing? There's
a number of very common sense changes that need to happen on the front end. For example, if a school is about to go out of business and collapse suddenly, there's nothing stopping that from being the case for GI Bill benefits purposes. Or if a individual is teaching a class under Title 38 benefits, there's no requirement that they have any expertise whatsoever in the material that they're teaching. You can quite literally pluck a person off the street and have them teach advanced physics, and there's nothing saying that that's not a problem under Title 38 right now. So there's a number of very common sense changes we'd like to see, and that's, we call that program approval standards. For a program or a school to be approved in the first place for GI Bill eligibility, they should meet very basic criteria. And there are, frankly, very minimal standards at present. So that's something that we would like to affect.
Well, here's hoping that it doesn't take as long this time to get the changes put in place.
I'm with you on that. I think really what it comes down to is anybody who's willing to speak up about their experience and raise their voice about the importance of having these changes, we certainly welcome that. And anybody who's looking for an attorney to speak with, our staff does that full time, totally for free. At the end of the day, we just want to make sure veterans get the most out of their higher education benefits that they've earned as they can.
I've been speaking with Will Hubbard. He's Vice President for Veterans and Military Policy at Veterans Education Success. Will, thanks so much for joining me, and thanks for bringing this issue to our attention.
Thanks, Terry. We appreciate it.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.